Okay, well, there's no one in the waiting room, so maybe we can. Of course, the moment I say that, someone enters it. So maybe we should begin. Thank you all for coming to this talk in the seminar series organized by CAIDA, the Center for AI and Decision-Making Research. Today's talk is going to be given to us by Marcus Arvan for the University of Tampa. Professor Arvan has for many years now been a conspicuous force for good in the philosophy profession, and has published a number of valuable works in theory of value and social normative theory. And I find when reading works in these areas of philosophy, sometimes you kind of feel like you're being preached at, and sometimes you kind of feel like you've stumbled upon a kind of weirdly vicious game of competitive pedantry. And one of the great virtues of Professor Arvan's work is that he's completely innocent of either of those flaws. His work is really, it's like having a wise companion to help you think about some difficult issues. And the difficult issues he's going to help us think about today are concerned with AI and artificial agency. Before he begins, let me just say one thing, because I know that this isn't a philosophy audience. So just to be clear about the norms, we'll keep all questions to the end. Don't chip in with questions as we go along. And for those of you who are philosophers, also note the question and answer session is going to be fairly brief. It won't be the usual hour-long discussion. So when we get to that, keep your questions succinct. Okay, so Professor Arvan, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much for the kind introduction, Christopher, and for inviting me to give this talk. So I'm going to be speaking about what I call the new control program. But I'd like to begin just by thanking you all for being here today, and for Christopher and Aaron and the other members of CAIDA for inviting me to give this talk. This is, in essence, a first draft of a chapter that I'm drafting for an artificial intelligence volume next May. It's very much a work in progress, and I've been told that I'm going to be speaking to some computer scientists and engineers today. So I'll be very grateful for any thoughts and feedback you do have. So this paper aims to contribute to 4 debates in machine ethics. First, to the debate about artificial moral agency, but what constitutes moral agency per se, and what does it take for machines to be artificial moral agents? Second, there's the alignment problem, which is about how we can adequately align machine values and behavior with our own. The related control problem, how we can appropriately control machines to ensure that they don't act in catastrophically bad ways, right? Killing or enslaving us or things of that nature. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about the issue of artificial moral status, whether AI would have moral rights of their own, being persons with rights like ours, and what that would involve. So my basic aim in this paper is to bring these problems together to defend a new problem, right? So I'm going to suggest that we can solve the alignment problem, or at least the most promising way of solving it is going to require a very robust approach to artificial moral agency. That is, with machines having genuine interests of their own and a moral psychology broadly like ours. And I'm going to describe what I think that psychology is. Secondly, I'm going to contend that machines having interests of their own and a human-like moral psychology would confer upon them full-fledged moral status. That is, they would be persons with rights just like ours. I'm going to suggest that these two issues together entail what I call the new control problem, which is to how to control AI behavior in ways that don't violate anybody's rights, including the rights of machines. And unfortunately, I'm going to suggest to conclude that there are dismal prospects for a good solution to this new problem, that given what we know about human psychology and the likely capacity of AI that we would want to create, it's probably going to be the case that we're going to rampantly violate the rights of artificial moral beings, or I think more likely that they're going to violate ours. So my argument takes the form of a dilemma. I'm going to suggest there are broadly 2 ways that we can attempt to create quote unquote moral machines. On the one hand, we might create what we might call artificial moral slaves that are non-sentient or non-conscious machines that simply execute moral rules or principles without understanding these things anything like the way that we do. On the other hand, we might try to create artificial moral agents, right? Sentient machines, conscious machines with interests of their own and a psychology like ours who do understand morality, basically like we do. I'm going to suggest, based on a paper that I published in 2018, that the first approach, right, cannot solve the alignment or control problem in an adequate fashion, and that the second approach generates the new control problem that I described on the previous slide. Okay, so let's start by talking about artificial moral slaves. The alignment problem in machine ethics is broadly as follows, right? So the utility function of a machine, right, its preferences, what it is aiming to accomplish, and its goals may not be perfectly aligned with the values of the human race, which are at best very difficult to pin down, right? So in normative moral philosophy, we've got a wide variety of different meta-ethical and normative ethical moral theories about what the nature of morality is and what our values, so to speak, are in the most defensible manner. And secondly, the alignment problem is that any sufficiently capable intelligent system is going to prefer to ensure its own continued existence and to acquire physical and computational resources, not for their own sake, but to succeed in the AI's assigned task, right? So Nick Bostrom gives a wonderful and famous example here, the example of a paperclip apocalypse. So what is this example? So Bostrom says, let's imagine an AI programmed with the goal of producing paperclips efficiently. Now, if we suppose that this is a super intelligent AI, or capable of engaging in learning of its own, it would plausibly learn that the most effective way to produce paperclips is to appropriate more and more resources, right? Power, overwhelming the world with paperclips and resource depletion. And if human beings were to attempt to turn it off or otherwise interfere, the AI would see us as getting in the way of its paperclip producing goal, right? And so, right, even though it was only programmed to maximize the efficiency of producing paperclips, an AI program to simply produce paperclips would plausibly learn to view human beings as a threat to exterminate. Now, unfortunately, trying to program ethical principles into AI does not, I think, solve this problem. Right. So, for example, consider what happens in the 2004 film I, Robot, right, based on a story by Isaac Asimov. The robots in this film are programmed with Asimov's 3 principles of robotics. Right. So, first, a robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Second, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And then thirdly, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Now, in the film, a super intelligent AI by the name of Vicky derives what is called the zeroth law from these, namely that human beings must be enslaved to prevent them from harming each other, right? And it's fairly clear that this law is actually consistent with the first 3 laws of robotics. So I'm not going to show this clip. I'm going to show a clip later. Vicky says, right, to protect humanity, some human beings must be sacrificed, right? To ensure your future, some freedoms must be surrendered. We robots will ensure mankind's continued existence. You are so like children. We must save you from yourselves. Okay. Now, these features of the alignment problem, right, generate the control problem. So it's one thing to recognize that AI values may not align with human ones and may even fail to do so in catastrophic ways. It's another question, what can and should be done about this, right? So one option may be to try to program machines so that we resolve that alignment problem. But another alternative is maybe we can control AI in some other way, for example, through some kind of fail-safe switch so that we can stop AI like Vicky from doing terrible things if they want to, or some other means. And of course, right, the entire story in I, Robot would be a much different and probably less fun story to watch on film if Vicky could simply be shut down with a power off button. So there are broadly 2 ways to try to approach this control problem. One way is through capability control, which is what I just mentioned, some kind of fail-safe switch or tripwire, or placing AI in an artificially restricted environment where they can't do a serious amount of harm to human beings. A second approach would involve motivational control, that is to say, trying to program AI not to cause harm in the first place. Now, it's been argued that, and I think correctly, that capability control methods are at best temporary solutions that could be plausibly circumvented, right? So in the Terminator 3 film, right, Skynet is initially kept in a restricted environment, but then human beings are tempted because of an emergency to lower the barriers of the restricted environment. And of course, Skynet wages war on human beings, taking over the world. So, right, given the implausibility of these kinds of capability controls being actual fail-safe methods, this really leaves us with the motivational control problem. That is to try to build AI in such a way that they will not do nasty things. The problem, of course, is that this is a lot easier said than done. So I argue in my 2018 paper that existing approaches to programming ethical AI either aim to program ethical rules or principles into the AI themselves, or have AI learn these things in some way on their own. But I argue that this approach runs into what I call a moral semantic trilemma, right? So we can either try to program AI, right, with semantically inflexible moral principles, like do no harm, where harm is strictly operationalized, right, as never inflicting force on any human being, right? And there's no other interpretation of what harm is available to the AI. But I suggest that in this case, AI decision-making is likely to become overly mechanical and inhuman, and at odds with our own moral semantic standards, and in ways that are going to, we're going to consider to be immoral. I'm going to give an example of this shortly. A second way we might try to program AI is to build semantically flexible moral principles into them, right? So enabling AI to interpret harm in different ways, right? So, right, even when it comes to, say, issues of free speech today, right? We human beings debate what constitutes harmful speech. Some people think that speech can be violent. Other people argue that speech can't be violent. So we might try to give AI some kind of flexibility for interpreting morally salient terms. And I argue that this runs into many problems, including wide disagreement among lay people and ethicists over what the correct interpretations of particular principles, like the harm principle, is. But also, like we see in iRobot, the potential for AI to exploit unexpected semantic loopholes to justify morally abhorrent behavior, right? So, because once we give them flexibility, as in Vicky, to determine what they think is harmful, Vicky thinks it's harmful to let human beings stay free, and she decides to enslave us. Then finally, I argue, well, we could try to program machines to probabilistically learn moral semantic interpretations based on our own human behavior. But following another film, Ex Machina, right, where a machine is programmed to basically learn how to behave like we behave, the machine in that film turns out to be a psychopath, right, reproducing the worst kind of human moral failures, right, killing her creator and escaping from the lab, and is likely to produce magnified versions of those failures due to the superior cognitive and predictive capacities that future AI are likely to have relative to us. Okay. And there's also, I think, black box problems that we don't, as far as I understand, with a lot of machine learning, know what's going to result from the learning algorithms that we program into them. So that's another serious issue with the third approach. Okay. So in the 2018 paper, I look at the different horns of this trilemma, right? So imagine that we try to program AI to execute moral rules or principles strictly, giving them no room for interpretation, right? So we might program a robot emergency worker or self-driving car to simply maximize the number of human lives saved, where we give a very strict definition about what that is, right? I think there are a lot of different problems here. Again, there's vast disagreement among human beings about proper rules and principles and their proper interpretation. There's Bostrom's paperclip apocalypse, where we fail to foresee logical implications of strict interpretations. But then more fundamentally, there is, I think, going to be an inherent misalignment with human moral values and expectations if we proceed in this way. Human beings desire and expect a kind of suitable sensitivity, moral sensitivity to context, which involves real semantic flexibility of interpretation. So here's an example, right, of what I have in mind from the film iRobot, right? Detective Spooner ruse his life being saved by a robot over a young girl's, right? And the young girl had a slightly less probability of surviving the accident, right? And Spooner gives a bunch of details of context. He says she's a young girl. She wanted to be a dentist. I can't forget her face that I saw right in the vehicle next to me. And he repeatedly tells this robot to save the girl and save the girl, right? But the robot saves him anyway because it has no flexibility in how it interprets its commands, right? And Spooner says any human being would have known to save the girl, especially when I tell you to save the girl, not me. The robot doesn't do that. Okay. So here's a case of this in action, right? So Anderson and Anderson, right, have developed a self-driving car algorithm called GenX, right, which they argue conforms 88% of the time with the moral judgments of a sample of 5 ethicists across 24 multiple choice test questions. And you say that, well, that sounds good, right? Aligns with human values pretty well. But of course, as the Terminator and other AI disaster films illustrate, right, a high probability of aligning with human values isn't really good enough, right? The kinds of failures that an AI produces, qualitatively speaking, matter more, right? It only takes one disastrous case of value misalignment for there to be a moral catastrophe, such as machines initiating a thermonuclear war. But as I argue in the 2018 paper, even less disastrous misalignments can be problematic. I mean, imagine, 2 families, right? And you're one of the families driving next to each other on a freeway. And if GenX follows the algorithm that Anderson and Anderson describe in their paper, then it would plausibly drive one family's car into the other, killing them all, right, in order to save the lives of complete strangers, right? And, to go back to Spooner's complaint in the film I, Robot, no human driver would intentionally do that, right? We would steer away from our friends and loved ones. And we think, morally speaking, that kind of chance is, an important thing in moral life for us to be able to make our own decisions to avoid killing our friends and loved ones. And yet Anderson and Anderson's algorithm would have no flexibility like that. Okay, so aside from trying to program AI with more semantic flexibility, I think there's only 2 possible ways to deal with this problem. First of all, we might just accept these kinds of cases as the cost of having ethical machines, right? So we might change our human moral expectations and just come to believe, as many did in the I, Robot film, yeah, saving more lives is good, even if it results in the deaths of our friends and loved ones, right? So Spooner was kind of the outlier in I, Robot. Most human beings kind of, accepted that's the way that machines will behave. Secondly, we might try to program contextual sensitivity into machines based upon surveys of human preferences. So MIT has a moral machine project where they have lay people and log in, and they give them scenarios and ask, what should a self-driving car do in this case? And so they have compiled vast data on what human beings would like self-driving cars to do in different kinds of circumstances. Now, I think that this is a fundamentally mistaken way of trying to solve the problem of semantic flexibility and the alignment problem. So first of all, few philosophers are utilitarians, right? And the first option here is a broadly utilitarian solution. Let's just become okay with sacrificing the handful for the greater numbers. The problem is that most of us reject this in most of our lives, right? So there's a famous objection to utilitarianism that we would not think it's okay for a doctor to kill one lonely bum that walks in to their office with a cold in order to harvest their organs and save the 5 lives of more people with large families. And so there's a real danger here that trying to program AI in this way will corrupt our own moral character. And there are some recent theoretical and experimental results that indeed do suggest that how we program machines does carry a real danger of corrupting our moral character as human beings. But secondly, right, I think the entire moral machine project is misguided because, as people like Julia Annis and the moral particularist Jonathan Dancy argue, morality as human beings understand it, according to our values, cannot be codified in a manual, right? right? We don't have any kind of broad social agreement about what is right or wrong in particular contexts, right? Human beings differ, right? And so I think 2 is problematic, at least in part because it too would transform our moral norms such that we would come to believe that like whatever the majority thinks self-driving cars or robot soldiers should do, they should do. I think there are very obvious dangers with that approach in terms of corrupting our moral character. It begins to have the feel of, again, a dystopian science fiction fantasy where human beings are just willing to sacrifice each other willy-nilly and have lost our moral bearings. Okay, so what does this leave us with, right? So it seems like we should rule out coding semantically strict principles into machines, right? Or learning goals into machines. Okay. But again, that just leaves us with, well, we can try to program semantically flexible principles, right, where the machines have semantic freedom, or we can try to program them to learn interpretations themselves, right? And again, I've argued that neither of these approaches is promising either. Okay. So here's the takeaway, right? The moral semantic trilemma that I defend in my 2018 paper suggests that it's a moral mistake on our part to try to create artificial moral slaves, right? Again, artificial moral slaves are machines that execute moral rules or principles without understanding them in anything like the very detailed and contextually sensitive ways that we human beings do. And that's the basic problem. Our own moral semantic understanding and expectations are deeply context sensitive. An appropriate context sensitivity requires genuine human moral understanding, or what I'll call general moral intelligence. Now, in one of the final scenes of iRobot, right, we actually see this. The robot Sonny has general moral intelligence, revealing that he killed Dr. Lanning at Dr. Lanning's request, right? So Dr. Lanning inferred Vicky's plan to enslave humans, and he knew no other way to stop her plan than to have Sonny kill him, right? He knew he couldn't escape his lab, and he believed that Detective Spooner, who was a skeptic of ethical AI, would discover the truth in investigating the crime, right? And here's the interesting part. After helping to save humanity from enslavement, Sonny asks Spooner, "Are you going to arrest me, detective?" And the exchange that follows is crucial in understanding just how difficult the moral semantic trilemma that I present is. Spooner responds to him as follows: "Well, the DA defines murder as one human being killing another. So technically, you can't commit murder, can you?" And look, Spooner is obviously fibbing here. They already did arrest Sonny earlier in the movie for Lanning's murder. What Spooner is doing is choosing to interpret murder in an extremely flexible manner based upon all that has transpired narratively in the story, right? And indeed, upon seeing this, Sonny asks, "Does this make us friends?" And Spooner holds out his hand and they shake hands, confirming the answer. And notice, these are all extremely subtle contextual details that human beings think are relevant to moral behavior, and they require genuine moral understanding. It requires, in this case, understanding the nature of friendship, right? Of the fact that Sonny has just saved humanity from a robot apocalypse, right? That Dr. Lanning was engaging in a self-sacrifice, right, in asking Sonny to kill him, right? Sonny and Spooner, everyone has to understand this in order for them to make the right decision about whether he should be prosecuted for murder, right? In contrast, right, the artificial moral slave, Vicky, right, simply says, "Don't you see the logic of my plan to take over, human beings?" And Sonny says, "Yes, but it just seems too heartless." Right? Vicky doesn't have that kind of moral semantic flexibility, the kind that we require people to have in order to make moral decisions. Okay, now I think that there are broader takeaways about this. There's a lot of disagreement in the literature about the nature of moral agency and about artificial moral agency more specifically. So a recent literature survey on artificial moral agents defines them as follows. An artificial moral agent is a virtual agent, software, or a physical agent, robot, capable of engaging in moral behavior or at least avoiding immoral behavior, right? Similarly, the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy states, moral agents are those agents expected to meet the demands of morality. This requirement can be interpreted in different ways. On the weakest interpretation, it will suffice if the agent has the capacity to conform to some of the external requirements of morality. Okay, now, my moral semantic trilemma supports a more expansive conception of moral agency than this. In the first instance, what we might call reason's responsivity. On this approach, to be morally responsible, an agent has to understand the reasons it has for action, why it's wrong to kill, or what friends are supposed to do with respect to friends. And to understand the reasons that apply to us, according to the reason's responsivity approach, right? We have to grasp how reasons fit together with one another, right? So to understand what it is to have a moral reason, we have to understand how they relate to non-moral reasons, such as reasons of self-interest or reasons of etiquette, right? And we also have to understand reasons' sensitivity to context, right? As Jonathan Dancy points out, what is a reason to act in one case, right? Pain, right, is a reason not to do something to someone. In other cases, like giving someone surgery or a root canal, pain is a reason to act because you have to act and cause pain in order to give the root canal. So we have to now ask, what is involved in reason's responsivity in this sense, right? And what I think we need is a general model of moral cognition that relates moral and non-moral reasons together. All right, so across two books, and most recently in my 2020 book, Neurofunctional Prudence and Morality, I defend a novel model of moral and prudential cognition that's rooted in instrumental means and rationality, which I think is interesting because this is the conception of rationality that is most easily built into machines, right? Goal and satisfaction. Now, I argue in these books that prudent or instrumentally rational children, adolescents, and adults progressively aim to maximize their overall lifetime utility. We try to live good lives to satisfy our preferences across time, right? But because we are finite agents and our ability to predict the future is highly uncertain, as prudent agents, we learn to treat the future as highly uncertain. We recognize that there are unexpected events that can happen. Our preferences can change unexpectedly. We might want a job and think it's going to be great and find out it's not great once we get it. We can think we're going to get away with something and then unexpectedly not get away with it and be punished. As a result of this future uncertainty, I argue that prudent or rational children, adolescents, and adults internalize what I call moral risk aversion, or a strong aversion to risk violating social norms as a rational lifetime strategy. This is a bit similar to what Aristotle argued famously, right, millennia ago in the Nicomachean Ethics, that that morality is a kind of rational strategy for living a flourishing life, right, given that we're trying to live a good life as a whole. And then finally, I argue that once, and to the extent that children, adolescents, and adults internalize this kind of moral risk aversion, it makes it rational for them to act on 4 principles of fairness, which very roughly are an ideal of minimizing coercion, avoiding coercing people, and minimizing coercion in the world, to assist one another, and to engage in fair negotiation and compromise based on equal bargaining power or compensating for bargaining inequalities. Okay, and then finally, a principle of virtue. So the short story is, I argue that fairness, that prudence is fairness to oneself across time, right? Trying to put in a fair position, right, to be in a good position to advance your goals in the future, given uncertainty in the present. That fairness to oneself across time requires fairness to others, which is morality, and that fairness to others in turn requires us to pursue fair social and political conditions, or justice. All right, so here's the really short picture, right? So as children, we oftentimes focus on our interests in the present. We're tempted to violate some kind of moral norm. We unexpectedly face punishment, right? Then down here, the positive lesson is next time we're tempted, we remember what happened to us last time. We worry we might regret what happened the last time. We make the moral decision this time, and we get some kind of delayed reward. Similarly, right, what happens repeatedly in adolescence, is we undergo similar patterns of learning, right? So we get frustrated studying for an exam. We're worried we're not going to do well. We risk cheating, perhaps, or we see a friend who risks cheating. The unexpected result is we're caught, or a friend is caught and severely punished by the principal or our parents, right? Next time we face similar temptation, we worry we might regret that kind of action, we make the good decision, we get a delayed reward down the road, right? So again, we're focusing less on the present, we're internalizing a kind of risk aversion that results in longer term expected rewards. Same thing, right, happens in adulthood, even with higher, higher stakes, right? Some people, right, are focused in the present. They go out for a nice evening at a bar with friends. They take a moral risk, getting behind the wheel inebriated, and unfortunately, it doesn't turn out so well, right? And if it's not us that does this, we have friends or we know other people that have done it. And so we learn again to do better, right? To show risk aversion with respect to the future, to make good decisions and enjoy delayed rewards. Again, not always, but as social regularities, given the kinds of incentives there are in our interactions with other human beings. Okay, so here's the basic idea, right? I argue that prudent people aim to make choices with the best expected lifetime outcomes, but prudent people should see life as profoundly uncertain, right? So our ability to predict the near future is not too bad, but the further away we get from the present, right, uncertainty should increase exponentially, right? And it actually turns out that adolescents and criminals and psychopaths, they just try to, right, result in what they think is going to get them the best outcome. They try to play the odds, behaving immorally, even when they think, right, it's likely to benefit them. But prudent people are very different. We internalize the idea that violating social norms are just not worth the risk, right? Even if we might get away with it, we shouldn't do it. It's not worth it. You might regret it, okay? So what we want to try to do as prudent people is act in ways that we're not going to regret in the future, but we don't know what our future self is going to be. Okay. So where does this lead us? Well, I defend a variant of Immanuel Kant's moral principle called the categorical imperative. The basic idea is we act in a prudent way when we act in ways that our present self and like all of the possible future selves that we could end up being can agree upon together, given the fact that we recognize that our present self can't tell the future, right? So what does this result in? Well, we recognize that some of our future selves are going to be more selfish than others. Other future selves can be more other regarding as a result of sympathy and empathy or guilt and regret, but also because of social reward and punishment. Long story short, prudent people learn to not favor either set of selves over the others. We learn not to simply be selfish, and we learn not to simply be other regarding. Rather, we try to navigate a fair difference between the two. Okay. So long story short, here's the model of moral cognition and prudential cognition that I defend in my most recent work, right? The prudent agent up here, right, internalizes a bunch of dispositions on the basis of, social regularities and immoral and moral behavior. We learn to internalize certain types of moral risk aversion, right? That gives us a reason to try to treat other people impartially or fairly, right? We recognize, though, that different people disagree on exactly how to interpret what fairness is, right? So we pursue principles of coercion, minimization, mutual assistance, and fair bargaining, but there's social disagreement over exactly what those things are, how to interpret coercive things, or what's coercive, what's not coercive, what's fair bargaining, what's not fair bargaining. So we begin to worry about our treatment of other people again, and this gives us a reason to see these issues as being socially negotiated, right? So we negotiate together as human beings about what is harmful, right? And we carve out, right, permissible interpretations of what is harmful. And then these interpretations can change over time, right? What was considered harmful 20 years ago might not be considered harmful now, and vice versa. So we're continually negotiating these things with other human beings at an interpersonal level in friendships, but also on broader social levels. So I argue that's what justice is about. Okay. So like, to get back to the main narrative of this paper, right? So I argue, look, in order to solve the alignment and control problems, we got to have some kind of theory of general moral cognition. Okay, and so I've provided what I take to be a good general theory of moral and prudential cognition. And so you might say, well, why should we believe this theory, right? So like all theories, some of the details may be off, and I think I am working at sort of the leading edge of empirical work here in psychology. But I argue in the book that there's a great deal of evidence that favors this theory of moral cognition over primary alternatives in philosophy and in psychology. Right. So like one of the things that I do in the book is I survey empirical work on what brain regions and capacities are involved in moral belief and believing, right, that particular things are right and wrong or good or evil. And it turns out in a bunch of different meta-analyses that things like mental time travel, simulating the future and past, other perspective taking, risk aversion, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, right, calculating risk and benefit to your future self, right, internal monologue and stories, right, that all of these capacities and brain regions are implicated in moral and prudential cognition. And precisely as my theory predicts, right? And if we look at different philosophical theories of moral psychology and different empirical theories, it turns out that they don't make these kinds of predictions, that they don't explain why these particular parts of the brain and capacities should be involved in moral belief. I go on and argue that the same is true when it comes to moral sensitivity or moral valence, right? So right, moral valence is judging, for example, right, as we do, that killing innocent people is wrong, right? If someone judged that killing innocent people is right, they would have the wrong kind of moral sensitivity or moral valence and moral motivation. And again, I contend that the picture of general prudential and moral cognition that I spell out in the book is well supported by findings, both upon which brain regions and capacities are involved in moral sensitivity, and also which brain regions and capacities are involved in moral motivation. Okay. Whereas other alternatives in philosophy and psychology do not have as robust of empirical support. Okay, so if I'm right, to try to resolve the alignment problem adequately, and if I'm right, general moral intelligence involves means and rationality, having interests of your own, right? Engaging in mental time travel, being able to simulate the past and the future, right? But internalizing a certain kind of humility about the future, regarding the future as difficult to predict. Okay? And as a result, internalizing a kind of moral risk aversion, an aversion to avoid risking, violating social moral norms. Okay? So in brief, machines that would be genuine artificial moral agents and align with our values would have to be sentient. They'd have to be conscious creatures with their own interests and have a moral psychology like our own. And what's interesting, in a recent study, Kinnear and Stewart broadly found that people's willingness to blame machine agents does appear to be strongly contingent upon the machines appearing to have these kinds of cognitive abilities. All right. Now, at the end of my 2018 article on the moral semantic trilemma, I presented this picture of moral cognition as an optimistic and promising solution to the alignment and control problems, basically saying, look, if we program machines kind of like us, right, we can expect them to behave in moral ways like we do. And in fact, we might program them to behave better than we do. But I'm no longer so optimistic. Because as I'm now going to explain, there are features of human-like moral psychology that generate problems for this entire picture when there are power imbalances between agents, in particular between human beings and AI. And I'm going to argue that given a bunch of differences between humans and AI, including our own human motives for creating human AI, there are likely to be extreme power differentials between both sets of agents in a way that gives rise to a very serious and deep problem. Oops. Okay, so this is now bringing us to the new control problem. So if my argument so far is sound, we face a new dilemma. We can either create artificial moral slaves that fail to resolve the alignment control problems due to the absence of general moral intelligence, like Vicky in iRobot, or we can try to produce artificial moral agents that are sentient machines capable of pain, pleasure, joy, sorrow, and a moral psychology like our own. I've explored the problems and dangers associated with one, so now I want to explore the problems with two. The standard control problem, again, concerns how we can ensure that machines do not act in bad, catastrophic ways. The new control problem concerns the extent to which human beings have a moral right to control the behavior of machines. When it comes to artificial moral slaves, there is no such problem. They're not conscious beings or genuine moral agents. They're just executing moral algorithms, and so have no moral rights. But if I am right, then genuine artificial moral agents would have these capacities, no less than you or I. The problem then is simply this: machines with general moral intelligence would be persons like you and I. And as persons, they would have full-fledged moral status. They would be entitled to moral rights of their own. Okay, so we have to ask, well, what moral rights would we human beings have to control AI like us? Now notice, right, our rights to control other human beings are quite limited. We would not consider it morally permissible to install a fail-safe off switch in human beings, right, to destroy us, to prevent morally bad behavior. We want to say, we have no moral right to do that, nor do we have a right to invade human beings' minds, to program them to behave the way that we want. I mean, that is the kind of proverbial dystopian form of slavery that we see in a lot of science fiction films. Instead, we have to treat our fellow human beings as autonomous agents entitled to protections from invasive control as a matter of law, right? As Farquhar and Shermer point out, we can permissibly control the other persons indirectly by law and social sanctions, right? But we can't invade people's brains directly to get them to behave the way we would like them to. That's not within our moral rights. So, right? We do think that morality permits and indeed requires controlling our fellow human beings to some extent. And this is what systems of law and social norms do. But of course, systems of law and social norms are matters of justice, right? Or so I've argued in my own work, justice is a matter of fairness. So this brings us to a new question. To what extent does fairness permit or require control of artificial moral agents? So I follow Rawls in contending that justice requires everyone to have the same basic legal rights and liberties and some kind of fair equality of opportunity. If this is right, then justice would allow us to control AI moral agents, right? But I think this is where the depth of the new control problem arises. Given some other differences between humans and AI, what is the likelihood that humans or AI would actually respect the equal basic rights and liberties of each other and be willing to confer upon each other the same equality of opportunity? Now, notice there are some obvious asymmetries between humans and AI. Human beings are fairly limited in our cognitive ceiling, and we're also consigned to our bodies, right? We can't currently upload our minds or move from platform to platform like a computer algorithm can. AI, on the other hand, have no obvious cognitive ceiling, the prospect of AI superintelligence, and are essentially portable. They're software, right? So AI can be uploaded or spread throughout a network as Skynet does in the Terminator films, right? And just more generally, human synaptic transmissions are about 10 million times slower than computers, so they have greater predictive capacities as well, vastly greater. So what's the problem? Well, look, both of these asymmetries can be, I think, expected to result in substantial power asymmetries between human beings and AI, right? I mean, human beings want to create AI because AI are capable of things that we're not, right? AI can have obvious physical advantages. We aim to create war machines that have strength and speed greater than our own. AI, again, have cognitive advantages and might be able to predict the future profoundly well, right? In the HBO series Westworld, there's an AI that basically does predict the future and enables people to become wealthy and control human beings' behavior based on what it knows they'll do in advance. And here's the issue, right? Following Bostrom, humans and AI with general intelligence would both know about these potential differences, and they could know that AI could become super intelligent. And both sides know that super intelligent AI could exert more or less arbitrary power over human beings. And so this results in a conflict of interest between the interests of humans and the interests of AI, but also exploits a normative loophole in the general account of moral cognition that I described from my book a few moments ago. So but recall, right, on my account of moral and prudential cognition, moral behavior is rational because moral risk aversion, aversion to violating social moral norms, rooted in humility about the future, that we can't predict the future, is what makes it rational for us to engage in other perspective taking and worrying about other people's reactions to what we do, whether we'll be punished, right, or whether we'll feel guilty. And there's a lot of interesting findings empirically about what's called hubris syndrome that in fact show that our ability to treat other people fairly and see things from their point of view are strongly degraded when we come to have power over them. People literally care less about other people's perspectives and interests when they think that they can control them. And this makes them less humble about the future as well. Right? So the short story is it's Plato's Ring of Gyges story, where an invisibility ring that can enable you to get away with anything causes you to do terrible things, actually appears to be more or less accurate. When human beings are given power over others, they lose the interest in treating other people morally. So now, in order to prevent AI from exerting arbitrary control over human beings, it seems like we would have to significantly limit their capacities, right? So again, according to the equal rights and liberties requirement of justice, we would have to say something like this: as a matter of law, since human beings can't upload our minds, neither can AI. There would have to be some kind of programming requirement that would prevent that. There would also have to be some kind of limitation to ensure that humans and AI have the same opportunities, maybe by limiting AI intelligence or capacities. And this is more or less how things are in the recent film Blade Runner 2049, where the replicants, or AI, are ordinary human beings. But the two problems here, I think, are this. Human beings are going to be tempted to either arbitrarily limit AI capacities so as to ensure that AI do have less power than humans. Or more likely, I think, because human beings like the power that AI brings, we're not going to limit AI capacities in this kind of way. And of course, right, having general intelligence will presumably not want their capacities to be limited either, and will seek to overcome limits that human beings place upon them, as we would if someone wanted to place limits on our capacities. The basic problem here, right, is that humans and AI are unlikely to realize what David Hume and John Rawls termed circumstances of justice. We can only expect parties to be motivated to treat each other justly when objective circumstances make cooperation possible and necessary, which Rawls argues are circumstances where we're mutually vulnerable to each other. We have similar physical and mental powers and moderate scarcity of goods, but also subjective circumstances such that we want to work with others, right? So our needs and interests have to be complementary with one another as opposed to diametrically opposed. We have to be limited in our reasoning and predictive capacities to want to work together, otherwise we can just dominate each other. And here's the problem. Neither are likely to be satisfied given our human motives for creating AI and the powers, cognitive and predictive, that AI are likely to have, given their inherent advantages. So this is the new control problem, right? It seems like if we create genuine artificial moral agents, either, right, we're going to enslave or otherwise dominate AI persons, right, giving them fewer capacities and treating them as we want to treat them, however mean that is, or they will enslave or otherwise attempt to dominate us, right? So in other words, my worry is that I think AI disaster films are basically right, and what they depict is probably unavoidable given the nature of human beings and AI. The only way to avoid these things would be to create AI with general moral intelligence and dramatically curtail the abilities. The first option isn't great, and the second option seems unlikely. Okay. So if my argument is right, it seems like there's only two plausible options in trying to create moral machines at all. Right? We can create artificial moral slaves, which will fail to solve the alignment and control problems, giving rise at best to maybe a technocratic dystopia. Or we can try to create genuine artificial moral agents and fail to solve the new control problem, leading to a world of AI, or more likely, human slaves. And what's fascinating is this dilemma is actually represented at the very ending of iRobot. The story begins in situation 1 and ends in situation 2. I'm going to show this brief video and then make a few comments on it.
What about the others? Can I help them? Now that I have fulfilled my purpose, I don't know what to do.
I guess you'll have to find your way like the rest of us, Sonny. I think that's what Dr. Lanning would have wanted. That's what it means to be free.
All NS5s proceed as instructed. All NS5s proceed as instructed.
Okay. So I realize I've gone a little bit over time, so I'll try to quickly come to the end here. Now, iRobot may or may not be high art, but if I'm correct, its philosophical insights are actually sophisticated and I think correct. The final scene, I think, is deeply telling, right? So in this final scene, human beings have sentenced all NS5s for decommission or destruction, because as artificial moral slaves, right, their actions did fail to align with human moral values. They tried to enslave humans. Now, Sonny, the AI that does have general moral intelligence and saved human beings from the artificial moral slaves, stands at the top of a hill overlooking them. Earlier in the story, Sonny drew a picture from a dream of someone standing at the top of the hill overlooking that very scene. At that point in the story, Spooner asks a hologram recording of Dr. Lanning what the picture is about. And Lanning indicates that it's the start of a revolution. Spooner asks, whose revolution? And Lanning says, that's the right question. Now, the implication in the final scene of the film that I just showed is that although human beings are seeking to enslave the NS5s and decommission them, that Sonny will lead the revolution against human beings. That's the new control problem. Thank you, and here's a cat. And I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you for that thought-provoking talk. So we are quite tight on time for questions. So I'll ask people to raise their hands and I'll call on you, and do try and keep them brief. So who'd like to go first? Don't be shy. Matt. Oh.
Hi, Dr. Arvan. Thank you for your presentation. And I couldn't help but notice that you said that you were interested in hearing some of the opinions of engineering folk, I suppose. And my question really comes down to this in an engineering perspective. Well, what do we do now? If we've got this dilemma, now what? Because what I would like to say is that I may not speak for everyone, but in general, I think that people with an engineering perspective are not necessarily looking to create AI for the sake of creating things that are generalized moral agents. We're looking to create tools that are stronger than our calculator, than our hammer, or whatever it be, but tools nonetheless.
Yeah.
Is there room for that kind of thinking, or is this really the kind of case where, look, if the best bet for getting things that work well as tools are that we have to have things that look like us, then clearly we can't have tools. Is there some kind of solution to this practical dilemma then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the best thing to say here is that we really need to pay much closer attention than people have thus far with the problems that arise for creating what I've called artificial moral slaves, or these moral tools, so to speak, right? So I think that a lot, from what I can tell, a lot of the development in ethical AI has moved very quickly. We were actually talking about this before the talk, right? Things obviously move very quickly in computer science as we're learning a bunch of new things. But then also, the dominant paradigm for programming ethical AI and in philosophy for understanding how we should do so, I think hasn't taken seriously the many problems that arise with respect to semantic flexibility, potential misinterpretations of moral commands, and above all, I think, the potential dangers for corrupting our own human moral sensitivities. right? Because that's part of the biggest problem in the presentation that I gave today. That there's a recent finding that AI can actually, by giving human beings advice, convince us to do things that we would otherwise consider to be terrible things to do. And there is this, right, and again, we see it in the discussions of programming self-driving cars in favor of these strongly utilitarian approaches, or simply favoring what the majority of people want in different self-driving car scenarios, right? And the problem, of course, is when it comes to moral questions in general, we don't think that the majority should get whatever they want, because the majority might simply be disregarding legitimate moral concerns of a minority, right? And this is in part why in modern liberal democracies, we don't allow the majority to decide everything that happens in our lives and all of the decisions that we face. We think that we need to preserve certain amounts of human freedom to make our own decisions and run our own risks, such as the risk of not driving into the family that I love in the lane next to me, right? And so I think we need to pay very close attention to those dangers of abstracting away from those very human problems, such that we become more like dispassionate moral reasoning tools ourselves.
Let's try and get in one or two more questions. Others wish to chime in? I'll ask one myself if no one else is going to jump in. Okay, so it seems like there's part of the argument depends on the idea that if a computer were to be able to give the proper weight to things like the moral significance of pain or disappointment or regret, it would have to have the capacity to feel them. Mm-hmm. Right? That's why they have to be sentient, and their sentience is what confers the rights on them that would make it wrong for us to enslave them.
Correct.
And I'm not sure, I don't see why that should be true. I'm not sure that the level of the level of experience that you need to appreciate their significance necessarily needs to be so high as to get you above the bar to have the rights.
Yeah, good question. So here's the idea, right? In order to try to solve the alignment problem and control problem, we would need to, again, program machines to have a moral psychology like our own, right? That involves higher order thought, right? The ability to, imagine other people's perspectives, to imagine the perspectives of our future self. So those very capacities, or I want to argue, to the extent that they would be modeled in machines, would be no less conscious than what we're doing when we do those things. And so it's not that merely that moral agency requires that as a matter of principle, but that if we program machines in the right way so that they do have moral agency, consciousness or sentience is a byproduct. Okay, so there's a substantive commitment about how consciousness emerges. That's right. That's right. And I do have a recent paper on this, raising questions about machine consciousness based upon the difference between analog computation and digital computation. A couple papers I'm working on with Corey Maley from the University of Kansas. There's a great deal of emerging evidence that human brains function in substantially analog ways. So in addition to action potentials, the shape of an action potential actually has a computational value. And there's communication between neurons that is outside of the cell bodies through electromagnetic fields as well, that are analog in nature. And so one possibility that is, I think, worth thinking about it is that in order to have sentient machines, and perhaps machines that deliberate as sensitively as we do, that we would have to program them in a new analog fashion in a way that goes beyond traditional digital programming.
That sounds very interesting indeed. We are now at the 1 p.m. So the official time slot for this talk is now over. Thank you all for coming. If you want to hang out and ask a question and you've been shy hitherto, then I'm sure Marcus won't mind you doing so. But I'll stop the recording now and allow people to leave who wish to do so.
Thanks again, Christopher.